Last year, I was ordained in this religion that has no dogma to offer a world desperate for answers. By tradition, to be called the Reverend in a world cynical and irreverent about moral ascendancy. To stand for a people of my sexual orientation assailed by intolerance and met with violence in many parts of the world. To represent a liberal faith in a country so Catholic that one can be jailed for offending religious feelings. It sure rocks to be a UU minister, right? When I was in senior kindergarten class at age 5, I drew the figure of a naked woman. My best friend Arlene caught a glimpse of my illustration and asked about it. I said, I want to kiss her. She panicked and told my teacher. My teacher told the principal, and the principal told my grandmother, who was then raising me. And my grandmother defended me. And the drawing was, in fact, of my teacher. I met my grandmother when I was 3. My family moved to her city shortly after Grandpa died. I became her life. And I lived with her till I was 12. The moment I learned to read at 3, she built me a library. She was excited. We lived in the part of the country with many Muslims, Indonesians, Indians, Vietnamese, and indigenous tribes called Lumads. I grew up a few blocks away from the University of Mindanao, hub of student activism, and in my youth have heard of grenade blasts too often for a kid to experience, and too close to home. But I couldn't picture another way of life growing up amid my grandmother's daily grumbling against martial law. She was a highly educated pharmacist whose alma mater was the same as our national leaders. When it was time for me to start high school, I've decided that I wanted to move north to Manila to be with my folks. Only in my second year of living there in 1983, I heard of a man who was shot at the airport and that thousands have come to this funeral. I learned then that disappearances and executions have been happening for more than a decade, that it's a horrible thing to have known only one president since my birth, that farmers and labor unionists were not all communists, that questions could be asked if anyone could remember them, that the man who died was the best bet against our president, the dictator, and that although martial law had been lifted 2 years before, the structures and the attitudes to power remained. From then on, I desired to know freedom. I was then 13 years old, suffering from an eating disorder. I had thought that coming to Manila was going to be happy because I would be with my parents. But I realized that at their young age, they were still partying and I had to be in charge of my 3 younger siblings. I had what I called leadership exhaustion. I would sometimes be down with fever as I could not rest from teaching my sisters to read. And so my desire for freedom was also for myself. 2 years later, after a snap election had been called by the dictator where he lost to the widow of that slain opposition leader, but to whom he hadn't conceded, rebellion became a desire that could not be named nor spoken about. No one wanted to be branded an anarchist or communist. Also, only a few people could remember what freedom was like. And as people grew angry, I let anger grow in me and rebelled against my parents. I soon resisted instruction, cut classes, and became a real problem child. But I soon regained my weight, and as I grasped feelings, I realized that I'm entitled to them. A year later, in 1986, I was to graduate high school. I had been accepted to that radical and public university, which was my grandmother's alma mater. Then, the 1986 uprising happened. 2 top members of the dictator's cabinet bolted, his defense minister and his cousin, a general. They sought the protection of the people. the Catholic Archbishop of Manila enjoined everyone to come to their aid. You must understand, the Philippines is a country with daily Catholic fiestas. Answering the Cardinal's call, the streets poured out with people. My mom and I went there with food and water for those in vigil. And for only 4 days, we faced soldiers, helicopters, and tanks with songs, flowers, prayers, smiles. Men, women, and children, including myself, complete with vendors and tricksters. It was a fiesta. And the dictator's armies defected one after the other. There was more fun on our side than his. So, on the 4th day, the dictator fled to Hawaii. A few months later, I started university as my country framed a new constitution. Let me take you back a bit. In 1902, John C. Spunner, a senator from Wisconsin, said, quote, "The Filipinos are not a nation, and there can be no political being that we call a people, one people. Because in the language of the Declaration of Independence, they lack the sentiment of nationality, and they are not capable by acquirement and characteristics of cohesion, power and organization and conception of right and law and order equal to the formation of a nation, which can be called a people in the sense that language is used," unquote. You see, the Philippines is a country of 7,107 islands. So yes, there's always a beach. Our country is the size of Arizona, but with 12 times its population. We have about 170 languages with about 100 indigenous tribes. You can see the diversity. Diverse in religious expression and traditions. We are not a nation, we were told. We, you know this experience when we are told we are too diverse to be called a religion, right? So between the 1898 revolution against the Spanish, and then we went to war against the Japanese, and then the 1986 pro-democracy uprising, and kicking out the US military bases shortly after, it has only been a few years short of a century. Our bloods are still boiling hot. Only 13 years ago, we had another uprising to oust and detain a president for plunder. Only last March have we ended a 17-year war with Muslim secessionists by coming to a peace agreement. This year, Obama came to our country hastily signing an agreement with our government for a new arrangement for use of our military bases. We don't doubt the US has never left us, but he should be warned. We already know that freedom is something we need to desire again and again, because we are the custodians of this paradise, a piece of which China is willing to fight over. Freedom. I believe the first task of faith is to introduce freedom again and again and again. Christ's first words at the temple, which were read to you earlier, were verses of liberation from Isaiah. The Buddha speaks of liberation from suffering and illusions. And so, in Islam, they promise release from oppression. And so on in many religions, salvation is the centerpiece. And each moment is a chance for an uprising of the spirit. An uprising that does not happen without desire. Ask, and it shall be given. Seek, and you shall find. It's been said, quote, "All noble acts and all works of art, both great and not so great, arise out of a deep and sometimes powerful urge. Throughout history, many highly spiritually realized men and women have left keen evidence that a close relationship to God makes one anything but passive and unproductive." These are words from a yoga teacher, Rod Stryker. Now, the Jesuit Reverend James Martin said, quote, "Our deep desires help us know God's desires for us. And God, I believe, encourages us to notice and name these desires in the same way that Jesus encouraged Bartimaeus, the blind beggar, to articulate his desire. "What do you want me to do for you?" he asks the man. "Rabbi," he said, "I want to see." UU was founded in the Philippines about 60 years ago. Reverend Toribio Quimada had been helping farmers secure titles to lands they have tilled for generations. In his desire to serve better, he stumbled upon UU in his research. He began to correspond with UUs in the US. In 1954, his congregations affiliated with the Universalist Church of America. His desire for social justice led him to run for public office. He was maligned as a heretic and died as one. As he was preparing to leave to attend GA group of assassins killed him, burning his home and church property. His family barely escaped. Today, his daughter, the Reverend Rebecca Quimada Sienes, schooled in Meadville, Lombard, holds together 27 congregations, having served 17 years intermittently as president of the UU Church of the Philippines. Despite my country's intense century of insurrections and resurrections, salvation, it seems, is a lover that wants to be desired often, and our young democracy leave much to be desired. In 2010, Carlos Celdran, a Catholic and a supporter of UUs in Manila, silently walked into the historic and majestic Manila Cathedral, where Catholic bishops held an ecumenical fair. Except that Carlos Celdran silently bore a placard with the word Damaso. Carlos was offended with offending religious feelings based on an archaic law. Damaso was this abusive and flatulent Catholic friar in the book authored by our national hero that sparked so much desire for freedom against the Spaniards. Carlos Celdran was protesting the Catholic clout that delayed the passage into law of the reproductive health bill that would inform people on contraception and sexuality. In my country, 11 mothers die daily. That's one for every 140. Carlos Celdran, a Spanish mestizo, has spoken in one of our UU meetings and has last month hosted a UU fundraiser with me in his living room, but he remains a Catholic. His case is now appealed in the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, the reproductive health bill is now a law. What if I told you, today you will be with me in paradise, and all you had to do was defend being there like we've been doing and keep desiring this paradise? The reason I told you the story of my life in my country is that maybe you will understand that I was brought here to this faith, not for any overwrought theology, but for our common desires, for love, service, community, and wisdom, despite such diversity, like the people of my country. It is not for an overhammered definition of an identity. People who think they share an identity are usually deluded about their sameness. Often we confuse the existence of choices and the act of choosing as proof of freedom. But we often choose without necessarily desiring any of the choices we made. What then if we started with desire? At the heart of creation is that we manifest better choices when we know our desires. And what if we set ourselves free and powerful to desire what we already have? What is innate and intrinsic? Our common reverence, our rights and freedoms, our well-being, our connectedness to others. Knowing our desires takes us back to ourselves and connects us to our ultimate concern, to recognize when the real and deepest desires that bring peace are expressing themselves as confusing desires that leave us empty. We only need to clarify desires we master against desires that master us. Desires that free us against desires that shackle us. Which desires lead us back to ourselves, to our freedom to desire our well-being, our self-respect, self-acceptance, self-mastery, or self-esteem in such selfish things that bring gifts to those around us. Because freedom cannot be given, it needs to be desired. And the unjust ways of the world can be supplanted only by a vision of justice clearly from our desires, our ultimate concern. 39 years ago, that 5-year-old child who drew a naked woman was freed by her desires early on to live honestly and brazenly, to reveal her truth so that others may reveal theirs. And it didn't disappoint her beloved grandmother that this child slid in the school honor roll from first honor to first honorable mention. And her grandmother's sensibility taught her that desiring the truth was a better gift than to have the best affirmation for living falsely. And she grew up to be a minister. I have been ordained by a religion that provokes my deepest desires, by tradition to be called the Reverend as we revere one another. As an embodiment of a people of my sexual orientation that is realizing the message of love and equality, there in a country whose religious feelings may need to be offended, because we need to lead authentic lives. Thank you.